Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast presented by Bee Culture. Beekeeping Today podcast is your source for beekeeping news, information, and entertainment. I'm Jeff Ott.
And I'm Kim Flatham.
Hey, Jeff and Kim. Today's sponsor is Global Patties. They're a family-operated business that manufactures protein supplement patties for honeybees. It's a good time to think about honeybee nutrition. Feeding your hives protein supplement patties will ensure that they produce strong and healthy colonies by increasing brood production and overall honey flow. Now is a great time to consider what type of patty is right for your area and your honeybees. Global offers a variety of standard patties as well as custom patties to meet your needs. No matter where you are, Global is ready to serve you out of their manufacturing plants in Airdrie, Alberta, and in Butte, Montana, or from distribution depots across the continent. Visit them today at www.globalpatties.com.
Hey, thanks a lot, Global Patties, and hey, everybody, thanks a lot for joining us today. We definitely appreciate all of our sponsors' support because without it, we couldn't be here. And with that, thanks to Bee Culture Magazine for continuing their presenting sponsorship of this podcast. Bee Culture has been the magazine for American beekeeping since 1873. Subscribe to Bee Culture today. We also want to thank 2 Million Blossoms that sponsored this episode. 2 Million Blossoms is a quarterly magazine dedicated to protecting all pollinators. Learn more on our Season 2, Episode 9 podcast with Kirsten Trainer and from visiting www.2millionblossoms.com, and that is with the number 2. And don't forget, we've just helped her launch a new podcast, and 2 Million Blossoms, the podcast. Check them out. And jumping back to sponsors, Kim, we want to welcome Better Bee to our list of sponsors. This will be the first podcast they're sponsoring in the last several months. So thank you, Better Bee, for being there.
And we're glad to have you aboard, Better Bee.
Yeah, you bet. I just bought some equipment from them getting ready for the spring, so it's good. It's good. Got a new BJ Sheriff jacket.
Ooh,
I'll be styling.
Nice.
Yeah, first one since
full suit or jacket?
Just the Honey Rustler jacket. Yeah, I'll be styling. I'm gonna be look nice, and it's the first one I've had since I bought the other one I had in Ohio, so it must be 1989, 1988.
Well, you got your money's worth.
Yes, I did. They hold up well. They
do.
Hey, Kim, we have a great show lined up today. We have Christina Grozinger talking about her new book or new paper on the climate change and its impact on the native bees. It ought to be real good.
I'm waiting to hear a lot about it. I've read the paper and some related stuff that she's been doing over at Penn State. So it'll be fun to be able to ask some questions that I got left unanswered when I read the paper.
Yeah, the climate change is obviously a very important topic for us all. And the insects and the native bees, they're probably the first line of defense among the first line of defense in the natural world to let us know the impacts of it. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you. So springtime in Ohio, how's it going there, Kim?
Well, it's hot today, actually. It's been up and down, but it's been way more warm than not the last week. And I got to tell you, I'm taking some chances here. I've done some 30 and 90 day look aheads for the weather.
Yeah.
And usually in this part of Ohio, you can't count on anything not freezing until after Memorial Day, the end of May. This year, the weather people are telling me I'm safe now. So I'm taking their word for it.
Fingers crossed.
Carefully.
Yeah.
And I've got stuff outside.
Oh, good.
And I'm planting and I'm growing and I'm hoping.
Well, I should be receiving a couple nukes, 2 or 3 nukes in the next week, I think, and which will be great because it's going to be nearly 60 today and 60s and almost 70 next week. So hopefully they'll get in while it's really nice. I'm looking forward to that.
Good enough weather for those murder hornets you got out there, Jeff.
Ouch. They're yak killers. They're not murder hornets.
Yak killers. Yep. That's it.
Thank you, Sven Eric. All right. Hey, so Kim, Honeybee Obscura is really motoring along. You guys are doing a great job with that.
Yeah, we've got a couple good ones coming up. We've got one on how to eat comb honey, believe it or not. And we've got one coming up on, what's the other subject? I just looked at it today. I forget what it was, but I'll tell you what we are got in the works.
Yeah.
Is we found a book published by the Root Company right about the turn of the last century. Mm-hmm. And the title of the book is, I got it right here, it's a little pamphlet. It's called Answers to 150 Questions Commonly Asked on Bees. And what we're doing is we're going back and we're taking a look at that, what's changed and what hasn't in all of those years. So we found some pretty interesting things. What people used to believe, well, maybe they didn't have it quite right and hadn't discovered some things, and some things haven't changed at all.
That's good. I bet the questions have changed. There'll be no questions on Varroa.
Not a one.
Yeah.
Nope.
No questions on tracheomite. No questions on oxalic acid.
No questions on imported honey.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of stuff out there that hasn't changed. Why do bees swarm and how come I got stung? And, a lot of those things haven't changed. So it's been fun going through it, and it'll be fun looking at what has and hasn't changed.
No questions on, is there an app that can tell me what my bees are thinking?
We got a thing you can put your hive on to tell you how much it weighs.
Yeah.
It's called a scale.
Postage scale. Yeah. Or the post. What was the old train station scales that was hard to come by for a while. Still are. Well, good. I'm looking forward to those. The Honeybee Obscura can be found on www.honeybeeobscura.com, and that's with Kim Flodham and Jim too. I encourage everybody to get out there and listen to it. It's a great podcast. Hey, Kim, you've been doing a lot of reading, and you receive a lot of books. You've come across anything that's of interest lately?
Yeah, I have. It's been a good season, I guess you'd say. Late winter, early spring for books coming out on pollination and pollinators. And I got two of them recently. One of them was by Jeff Ollerton, who Kirsten's been working with on her podcast. So I'll let her talk to you about his book. But I got another one here by a guy named Timothy Walker, and the title is Pollination: The Enduring Relationship Between Plant and Pollinator. It's published by Princeton University Press, so it's going to be a good book. Well, the size is 8 inches by 10 inches, so it's got, but I'll tell you what they have is hundreds of stunningly beautiful photos. And the way he laid the book out, well, let me read you the review that's going to be in Bee Culture coming up here in a bit. Give you a sneak preview. Pollination, of course, is essential to the survival of most plants on Earth. Some plants rely on the wind to transport pollen from one flower to another. Others employ an array of ingenious strategies to attract and exploit pollinators, whether they be insects, birds, or mammals. This beautifully illustrated book provides an excellent look at the wonders of pollination biology, drawing on the latest science to explain the extraordinarily complex relationship between plant and pollinator, and revealing why pollination is vital to healthy ecosystems and a healthy planet. I thoroughly enjoyed the format of this book. I got to tell you, it's just so well done. Nearly every page poses a question in big, bold type at the top of the page, and then answers that question, usually on that page, but sometimes 2 or 3. The author begins the story with a basic but detailed introduction on pollination biology and explores the many different tactics of plant reproduction. He shows how wind and water can be an effective yet wildly unpredictable means of pollination, and describes the intimate interactions of pollinating insects with bees and butterflies, beetles, birds, lizards, and bats. He even explores the world of managed bees a bit. Walker explores how plants bribe pollinators using odor, colors, and shapes, and how plants rely on rewards as well as trickery to attract animals. He touches on the important role of pollination in ecology, evolution, and agriculture, and then discusses why habitat management, species recovery programs, and other conservation efforts are more critical now than ever. It sounds a little bit like Christina's article that she just came out with. It's going to incorporate some of this, but I got to tell you, Jeff, if you want to know what pollinators look like, the birds and bats and bees and all the things that he talks about, he's got them in this book. It's stunningly beautiful.
I look forward to it. It sounds like a great book. There are some great books out there. And a couple episodes ago, we talked about 2 publications by Bee Informed Partnership, and I did order them and received them, and they are really, really good. The first is the Commercial Beekeeping a Field Guide. Like you said, it is fits right in the back pocket. You can carry it around. It is really a nice guidebook. Boy, I really encourage that to everybody. And I think that anybody who's working with their working with the bees and want to take a look at, hey, is this something that I need to be worried about, be concerned about? Is this a disease? What am I looking at? They also have a second book, The Diagnosis and Treatment of Common Honeybee Diseases. It's a second edition. We talked about it before, but after reading through it and thumbing through it, and I'm impressed with the work they do. And again, it's good. The illustrations and the photographs in both of these books are wonderful.
Yeah, the commercial beekeeping one is that should be required reading for anybody who's been keeping bees more than 20 minutes, I think. It's wow, everything you ever wanted to know is answered in that book somewhere, somehow, I think.
Yeah.
The guys did a good job, and I hope it does well for them.
Yes.
And just so you want to know, if you want to get that book, you go to their website, and for a $30 donation that they can use to further their organization, they'll send you a copy of that book. It's worth every penny.
It sure is. And we'll have that link in our show notes. All right, let's have a quick word from our friends at Strong Microbials, and then we'll get right into our interview with Christina.
Hello, beekeepers. Your honeybees face a lot of challenges out there. Unbalanced food sources from monoculture crops, holding yards, drought, food shortages, antibiotics, pesticides, and pathogens like chalk brood. To overcome these challenges, your bees need the multiple bacteria that are in all nectars, pollens, and the environment. These bacteria aid honeybees' digestion and improve your honeybees' response and resilience to pesticides. Now you can help improve your honey colony health with a quick, easy, and safe-to-use product. Strong Microbials Super DFM Honeybee uses naturally occurring bacteria to restore the healthy gut biome of your honeybees. Check them out today at www.strongmicrobials.com.
Welcome back, everybody. And with us now is Dr. Christina Grozinger from Penn State. Sorry about that, Christina. Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast.
Thank you, Jeff and Kim, for inviting me. I'm so excited to talk with you.
Christina, yes, I'm glad you could make it today. I've been reading some of your work because it is exactly answers some of the questions that I have. I still need more answers, but you're one of the few people that are looking at this as much as I am, but it has to do with climate change, the plants that bees, wild bees and honeybees are foraging on, the successful overwintering, predictability, all of these things. What is climate change doing to our bees?
Yes, well, so we've been looking at that. We had sort of two major studies where we looked at that that just came out in the last couple of months. And it's interesting because we went into this work not necessarily really thinking that much about weather and climate, but just sort of letting the data take us where it takes us. And so in the first project, we actually were using data that were collected by the Pennsylvania State Beekeeper Association. So they do an annual winter bee survival survey of their members. And they've been doing it for many years. And we were interested in seeing how sort of landscape conditions might influence winter survival, thinking that areas that have, better forage, might have better survival, or areas where there's higher pesticide use, there might be less survival. And so we asked them if they could include in their survey the option for people to put down the GPS locations of their apiaries. So we could get something very specific about the location where people were reporting their results from. And so from that, we were able to get 3 years worth of data, and it ended up being several hundred colonies. And we analyze that using a statistical approach that allows you to put lots of different variables into the analysis. And this was work that was done in collaboration with Sarah Gosley, who is our sort of main sort of statistical and ecological collaborator on this.
So a quick question, Christina. I want to interrupt you for a second here. When you say landscape, you're comparing bees in an urban landscape versus bees in an agriculture landscape versus bees in a wooded or meadow landscape?
Yeah, so all of those actually. So the indices. So we developed these landscape indices that are not about whether it's urban or whether it's agricultural, natural, which is usually the way people sort of look at this. We developed these indices that actually describe these sort of ecologically relevant conditions for bees, right? So the forage quality, the insecticide toxic load. And then for wild bees, the nesting resource index. And so that basically allows us to look across all of these landscapes and just give these sort of ecologically relevant scores for these bees, as opposed to, things that we don't really know how to interpret, right? So like sometimes urban areas can be really great for bees if you have sort of the right green spaces in them, for example. And thanks for that question, because actually all those indices are in our Beescape app. So if you go to beescape.org, you can basically look at that, and it gives you the entire continental United States, and you can drop a pin and get the scores for your site for those different indices. So that was what we were able to, again, like look across all of these very different landscapes, but kind of boil it down to this sort of common information about these resources or threats, like in the case of insecticides that bees might be experiencing.
All of your bees, all of the apiaries, that you were looking at are in Pennsylvania because you had data from the Pennsylvania beekeepers. So everything that you're referring to has a border.
Exactly. So right now the study is only for Pennsylvania, but through our Beescape program, we're asking people if they can provide this information for their apiaries, and so we're getting information from across the rest of the country on this as well, so that we can again try to see what is driving winter losses more broadly outside of Pennsylvania. So in this study, we threw in all of our landscape indices. And we also included weather and climate factors, because this is our collaborator, Sarah Gossley. This is a thing that she specializes in. And so because they're not easy to get these variables and to put them into this sort of context, so we're very lucky to be able to work with her on that. And so when we threw everything together and did the analysis to see what were the main drivers, first was whether or not the beekeeper treated for varroa. Right. So that was a major factor. And if you did not treat for varroa, you had lower survival, much lower survival than if you treated for varroa. And actually, most of the beekeepers who answered the survey and who gave the data on their locations, they mostly did treat for varroa. So we decided just to focus on that group. And that group still had a lot of variation in sort of the outcomes of their survival. And so then when we looked at that, what we found was that the major predictor of winter survival was the summer conditions the year before, and specifically the temperature, which was, we calculated that in terms of growing degree days, and then also the precipitation. And so this was, for us, really surprising because we thought landscape should be playing a much more important role. But it's possible also that the beekeepers are compensating for landscape in some way, right? So that we didn't include whether or not people were doing supplementary feeding, for example. And then also, if we thought that weather was going to be important, our expectation was that it would be the winter weather conditions, sort of how severe they were or how long the winter was. But we looked at that, and that actually did not end up being an important predictor. So it was actually what the bees experienced in the growing season before they went into the winter that was most important.
Hey, can you define growing degree days?
Yeah, so growing degree days is basically saying you set a certain threshold of a temperature, and that can kind of vary depending on what you're interested in. And then you say how many days do you pass that threshold, essentially, and then you just count those up, right? So it's sort of a measure of how long it has been hot, right? If you sort of measure it that way, and it's often used for for plantings to understand when your crop is expected to grow or bloom, but it's just an sort of an easy metric that again encapsulates this idea of being above a certain temperature for a certain amount of time.
All right. And so it's more than just an average of of a given day. It's a time above the threshold.
Exactly. It's a time above a threshold.
Okay.
So it's not the average temperature in the past summer. It's more this accumulation of these temperatures.
All right. Thanks.
Yep.
Better Bee is pleased to sponsor today's episode of Beekeeping Today podcast. For over 40 years, Better Bee has supplied beekeepers across the country with the tools, equipment, and knowledge needed to succeed. Because many Better Bee employees are beekeepers themselves, they understand your needs and challenges and are better prepared to answer your beekeeping questions. From their colorful catalog to their support of beekeeper educational activities, including this podcast, Better Bee truly lives up to their tagline of beekeepers serving beekeepers. See for yourself at betterbee.com.
Well, Christina, that's I tell you, that leads me to the question the biggest question I have on climate change. And you were talking about growing degree days, and I've been using those for years. They're very predictive. I know when something's going to sprout. I know when it's going to grow. I know when it's going to bloom. I know when the fruit is ripe. All growing degree days answer all of those, or almost all of those questions fairly predictably. If the growing degree days change and things are warmer earlier in the season, the plants will undoubtedly respond earlier. I'm pretty certain they'll respond earlier. But because of photoperiod, will the bees respond earlier, or they're normally beginning to take off in late March, early April, and instead of that, they're going to have to go late February, early March or something to take advantage of the plants that are out there. Did you see some kind of effect like that?
Yeah, so that is very interesting, and I think this is where we need to take this research next, is to understand sort of what the mechanism is behind what we saw. So what we found was that there was actually kind of like a Goldilocks thing happening with the bees, where if you had sort of too high or too low growing degree days, or too high or too low precipitation, the survival was not as high, right? And so it's sort of, if you had too cool or too rainy or too hot or too dry a summer, then survival was lower. And so in terms of, what could be going on with that, like we have a couple of ideas. There is, as you talked about, sort of this idea of a phenology mismatch, are the spring flowers coming out earlier than the bees are able to take advantage of them. So that's one possibility, but there's also possibilities where if it's too rainy, the bees can't actually go out and forage as effectively. If it's too dry, then the plants are not going to flower as effectively. And then there could be more subtle things going on in terms of the plant physiology itself, or also the bees in terms of how quickly they're building up in the summer, and how quickly they switch over to going into their sort of fall and overwintering state. So I always like to tell people about this research study that was done by one of my collaborators. I was not a collaborator on this particular study. His name is Dr. Junpen Mu, and he's in China, and he has done work over many years in the Tibetan alpine plateaus, looking at the flowers there. And there is one particular species of herbaceous flowers that produces a lot of nectar, and beekeepers will take their colonies to these locations in the summer to make their honey crops. And so he was interested in looking to see what happened to these flowers under climate change conditions. And so he set up these little plots where he put, essentially it's like tarp kind of around these 1 by 1 meter plots, just to increase the background temperature just by a degree or a degree and a half. So nothing really very dramatic. And again, kind of what would be expected from under a climate change scenario. And then in these either climate change or normal plots, he counted the number of flowers per plant, the number of plants in that plot, and then the amount of, he extracted the nectar from each flower. So he could get a per meter square nectar production volume. And so what do you think happened between the regular and the climate change plot? What change do you think happened in the total nectar volume?
Well, that's a good question, and that's kind of the question I've been trying to discover the answer to, because I want to be able to know what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future relative to what happened last summer.
Yeah, well, I want you to take a guess, Kim. What do you think? How much of a change do you think happened? This is an interactive podcast. Yeah.
You didn't think you were going to get away without a quiz, did you, Kim?
I can't answer a question with a question. Okay. Well, my first thought would be that there is less nectar available, thus less honey, because of when you have a dry summer, you don't get as much honey. I mean, no matter what the reason, you're having a dry summer.
So in this case, it was just temperature, right? So it was just an increase in temperature. So the amount of precipitation was the same, but the amount of nectar produced in that climate change plot was 90% less.
90.
And so this is, it was basically that the plants were putting more energy into vegetative growth and less into the flowers and the nectar in the flowers. And so, and again, like I tell people this and they say, oh, well, over time there will be adaptation and not all species will respond in the same way, which is totally correct. But I think the point is that, that the effects that might be happening from these temperature or precipitation changes might be in ways that we're not necessarily expecting, right? So I think the phenology thing is a very obvious change that you would expect, but there might be these other things that could change that we're not really prepared for.
Were they blooming?
They were blooming. They just had less flowers.
Yeah,
less nectar means fewer bees, means less pollination. So
yes,
suddenly you've got seed production threatened. I can see where suddenly next summer there aren't nearly as many of those flowers around.
Yes. And also, and to sort of follow up on your point there's also going to be issues, of course, for wild bees and then potentially with wild bee populations, right? So with honeybees, they have a loving beekeeper who is taking care of them, right? And trying to sort of supplemental feeding and doing all these things to try to manage them. But with many of our, wild bee species, of course, they don't have anyone taking care of them and they're not social, right? So most bee species are solitary. And so that means that there's a very sort of direct line between what that one female can do in terms of collecting pollen to bring back to her nest and how many offspring she can produce, right? Which then directly influences how big the size of that population is. So we actually had another study that was looking at wild bees, and this was a project that was led by Melanie Kammerer, who was a graduate student in my lab at the time. And so she was using data that was coming from the USGS's bee monitoring program. And so this is a great program that Sam Droege has been running for over a decade. And so there's a lot of information from sort of the mid-Atlantic states on different sort of sampling sites. And so Melanie took this data set and she sort of cleaned it up and harmonized it in a way that she could analyze it. And I think there still ended up being over 900 sort of site year combinations. So it was, again, just a really wonderful data set to work with. And she did the same kind of approach where we took landscape variables and weather and climate variables, and weather being sort of like that particular year, and climate is sort of, what are the conditions over like a 15-year period. And so then she looked at wild bee abundance and wild bee species diversity. And what she found, first of all, was that there's a distinct spring bee community and a distinct summer bee species community. And so there's sort of very, very different groups of species that are involved in the spring and in the summer. And she found that they had different responses to these variables. But again, the main predictors for diversity and for abundance were these weather and climatic factors. And in the case of spring bees, if you had areas where there's more rain, you had fewer spring bees, which our interpretation is that they might not be able to forage as much. And the spring tends to be more rainy anyway, and that single female going out to get the pollen to feed her young, maybe she's not able to do that as easily. And then in areas that were hotter, there were fewer summer bees. And again, our interpretation of that is that that's something to do with the vegetation and maybe some drought conditions, for example. So there's, both the honeybees who are lovingly managed and these wild bees who are, need to experience what's going on around them without any support of a beekeeper are both being very strongly influenced by these weather and climate factors.
Well, I can see a future for somebody who's good at taking this summer's weather and using it to predict next summer's bee population. And it will be interesting to see if the factors remain the same, spring moisture and temperature. As far as I can determine, moisture and temperature are continuing to increase a little bit every year, or at least moisture is kind of not then, right?
Yeah, well, it really depends on where you're at.
Yeah,
so in Pennsylvania, we're going to get more rain. But one of the things that we did in the bee paper, the honeybee paper, was sort of mapping out, optimal conditions, I guess, across Pennsylvania, across the years of our study to sort of see, is there, one place that's always good and one place that's always bad. And there was a lot of variation. And so which again is sort of one of the predictions of climate change, is that there will be increasing variation. And so it'll be harder to predict these things, or to know that your particular region, is always going to be, a good place for bees.
It's always something, Jeff.
Yeah, I was just sitting here
you guys
considering all that. That's a lot to.
It's a lot.
Yeah, boy.
Well, this was one of the things that was actually quite frustrating for me, right? Because we went into this project with our beescape maps. We said, we're going to identify the main landscape factors, and not to say that forage and insecticide are not important. In Pennsylvania, we don't sort of have extremes on either end. So maybe this is partly why we didn't pick those up as being more significant. But, but all of those things are things that, somebody has more control over, right? So at least the landowners in the area where you have your bees, you can have conversations with them about sort of what to plant and what insecticides to use. But when you start thinking about weather and climate, that becomes a much broader issue. And it's much more challenging for an individual beekeeper to try to manage on their own. So this is, again, something where I think it's really highlights the importance of thinking collectively about these things.
I'm almost sorry I asked the question.
Sorry, Kim. Oh, you thought you only had Varroa to worry about. Varroa is still really important. But.
Well, on these two studies then combined, what have we missed, Christina?
What have we missed? I think it would be very interesting in the future, and this is, these are the things where you just need a lot more data and a lot more fine scale data, is to really understand, sort of how the bees are behaving in these different locations, right? So we have a study right now that we're doing in collaboration with a number of different groups, and this is a project that's being led by Gabriella Quinlan, who's a postdoc in my lab, where we're looking at hive scale data on automated hive scales to see how hives are gaining weight or losing weight across the season, and how this is influenced by landscape and climate, right? So I think that sort of more nuanced information can give a little bit more understanding of sort of at what point is the weather really creating an issue for these bees that then leads to these differences in winter outcomes. I think the other thing to think about is that we were looking at pretty coarse, I guess, measurements of climate and weather and land use, and so there might be sort of microclimate effects that we're missing, and that could be potentially, a strategy that can be used by beekeepers or land managers to mitigate some of these sort of larger scale effects. So if we can create a microclimate condition that is more suitable for bees, then that could have good outcomes.
Well, it sounds like you're going to get a lot of, or you're going to need a lot of input from just regular beekeepers, citizen scientists sort of thing. And not only in Pennsylvania, but from everywhere. So I guess if you're listening out there and you want to be a part of this program, we'll have how to get a hold of you in the show notes, right, Jeff?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yes,
Thank you. Well, I could say through our Beescape program, that's where you can register and then give us information on how, what the winter survival is for your bees. And we did use the data that we got from the Pennsylvania State beekeepers to make a little app, which we call Bee Winter Wise, which basically allows a beekeeper to drop a pin on their site in Pennsylvania and see the accumulation of growing degree days and see whether it's in sort of the range of being too hot or too cold, just to, again, give them some idea of potentially what they might be dealing with for the winter. So if we can get more data from more regions, then we can hopefully do that on a larger scale and try to help beekeepers more broadly.
There's a lot of effort in collecting on data. I'm sure you're trying to tie into and work with a lot of other people. I know Dr. Dewey Karen has a Pacific Northwest bee survey that is along those lines, as well as James Wilkes, part of the Hive Tracks group. And their bee data collection standardization efforts. So there's a lot of people putting a lot of hard work into this. I'm looking forward to the day when this all kind of comes together and we can get a really better global picture of state of affairs.
Yes. No, I think this can't be done without a lot of input and engagement with beekeepers to understand, to get the detail of data that we need, but then also to understand, what results are most helpful for beekeepers, right? So what can we tell them that can actually help them adjust their management practices in some ways to get better outcomes? Because, it's not, you can't do everything as a beekeeper. There's some things that are easier to do than others. And so keeping that in mind as well is really important.
Yeah, I was just thinking of all of the sensors that are out there, Broodminder and the other sensors. If you could grab all that data and tie it all together and watch it, you could really watch and see the progression of the nectar flows and the seasonal flows as it progresses across the country from north to south or east or west.
Yes. Yep, exactly. And we've actually been talking with the folks from Broodminder to have access to to their sort of broader data sets so that we can start to look at that in more detail. And I will say, the hive scale data is really quite messy and it's not easy to work with. And I had another former postdoc in the lab, Doug Sponsler, did develop a system for working with that data and kind of smoothing it out a bit. And so he did his work in Philadelphia, and he was working with a local beekeeper there, Don Schumpf, who had all these rooftop apiaries. And so Doug put his Broodminder scales on these apiaries, and then he also collected the pollen that was coming into colonies over sort of the growing season. And so he was able to see very clearly, when the flows happened and when the dearths happened, there was, in terms of how bad the dearth was different between the years, which again was probably a climate and weather factor that we weren't really able to pull out because it was only a 2-year study. But then he could also see, what were the most important plants that the bees were foraging on. And it's, not unexpected, I guess. In the spring, they foraged on trees. And so I think, another easy thing to convince urban areas to do is, when you're planting street trees, try to think of the bees when you do that and try to plant things that the bees can forage on, because that can be like a huge bonanza for a honeybee colony in the springtime.
Not so much for my eyes.
Yes, I'm sorry. Think of the bees,
Jeff. I hate the tree pollen. Bees love it.
Well, you're going to be doing this again this summer, Christina?
Yes. Well, we're collecting data that's coming in through our Beescape portal, and then sort of when we have had sort of enough of it over a long enough period of time, which I'm hoping by the end of this year or maybe in sort of early 2022, we'll be able to kind of rerun this analysis, but on a larger scale, and try to see how things may differ between different regions, and again be able to get this this sort of multi-year difference that we really need to look at, because again the weather is so variable across the years.
Well, we hope we can get you back to give us the answer. How's that?
Awesome. I would be very happy to come back and talk to you anytime. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, and we wish you the best and look forward to hearing from you again. I've been looking at the Beescape app as the website as we've been talking, and it's really fascinating. So we will have that link in the show notes and encourage everyone to go out there and participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Christina. Take care.
Hey, Kim, it was really great to have Christina on the show and to talk about her research. I think it's important stuff these days.
Well, not only important, but it's something I've been really interested in for quite a while, is what's going on with climate change and bees and plants and pollination and the whole bit. And it was good to get some of the answers. It'll be even better to get more of them when she gets done with the next arm of her research, I think. I was particularly impressed with the piece of information that said what's most important for winter survival was the weather last year, and in fact the temperature last year. That was amazing.
Yeah, everyone's always focused on the current conditions.
Yep.
I guess it goes back to if you prep the bees to the best of your abilities in the fall, they'll make it through the winter.
Well,
and part of the prep is understanding how they're going into the winter.
Take it back even further. What are they doing in July? Because that's what's happening outside the hive in July is going to be affecting what's happening inside come January and February next year. So that was good to know. And one more little tool you can use to increase survival.
Information overload at times, I think.
You think?
So just go out back and open a hive and just look there and wonder, and you just quit thinking. That would be good.
Yeah, that's. I'm going to try doing that this week.
All right, well, that wraps it up for this episode. Before we go, I want to encourage our listeners to rate us 5 stars in Apple Podcasts, wherever you download and stream the show. Your vote helps other beekeepers find us quicker. Even better, write a review and let other beekeepers looking for a new podcast know what you'd like. You can get there directly from our website by clicking on reviews along the top of any page, and we thank the folks who have done that in the last week or two. We appreciate your feedback and your reviews. As always, we thank Bee Culture, the magazine for American beekeeping, for their continued support of Beekeeping Today podcast. We want to thank our regular episode sponsor, Global Patties. Check them out at www.globalpatties.com. We also want to thank our friends Vera and Slava and their team at Strong Microbials for their support of this podcast. Check out their probiotic line at www.strongmicrobials.com. And we really want to thank Better Bees for joining our list of sponsors. We encourage all of our listeners to go out and check out Better Bees and the great lineup of products they have available for all beekeepers. And their link will be in our show notes.
Welcome aboard, Better Bee. It's good to have you here.
You bet. And finally, we want to thank you, the Beekeeping Today podcast listener, for joining us on this show. Feel free to send us questions and comments at questions@Beekeeping Today podcast. We'd really love to hear from you. Anything else, Kim?
I think that about wraps it up, Jeff. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Take care, everybody.